Be careful of the gray man when you walk along the train tracks. I used to live in the middle of backwoods Pennsylvania, near a set of train tracks that ran through the woods. About once, maybe twice a week, I would hear the cry of a train horn splitting the air, always at a different time but usually in the early morning or late evening. Sometimes it would even wake me from a dead sleep in the middle of the night. The little house I was renting was nice, at the very end of the cul-de-sac I lived in, and nestled back against a copse of trees. I wasn't entirely sure where the train tracks were, since they didn't run through town anywhere, but every time I was startled by the piercing cry, I thought it sounded like it was coming from the woods. The longer I lived in that little house, the more curious I got about the train. Probably sounds silly, but I've always liked trains, and even though I found the train horn startling, it was comforting in a weird way too. Every time it sounded, my ears would perk up, and I would find myself tracing the sound as it moved, trying to pinpoint exactly where it came from and where it was going to. Finally, after about a year of that, I decided to take one of my days off and go look for the train tracks. I put a few bottles of water and some snacks in a backpack, put on my favorite pair of walking shoes, and practically skipped out the front door. It reminded me of being a kid. I didn't have the best home life, so it wasn't uncommon for me to pack a bag with enough provisions and comic books for the day before disappearing into the woods near our house. The woods were my escape, a place where I was safe from anger, yelling, and whatever my parents were throwing at each other that day. The forest was always calm and quiet. It made me feel safe, a feeling I couldn't always get at home. As I walked out my back door, I was reminded of that, and how much I loved going for those walks as a kid. I'll admit, I think I was expecting it to feel just as safe and magical now, but oh how wrong I was. The forest itself was perfect. Silence punctuated only by the occasional bird call or rustle of the leaves brushing each other in the wind. It was an early spring day and the earth was spongy from recent rainfall. Dew dripped lazily from the green trees and sparkled on the tall grass as I walked through it. I made my way in the approximate direction I heard the train horn coming from. No real plan in mind for when I found it, just enjoying the breeze as it played with my hair. After about an hour, I finally found the train tracks and let out an excited whoop when they came into view. I raced forward like a little kid until I got right next to them. Then I began walking parallel to the tracks, towards the mountains in the distance. My parents had always told me not to walk near train tracks, but I always wanted to follow them just once to see where I wound up. I followed the train tracks with a spring in my step, not noticing the sun sinking lower in the sky until the shadows grew long enough in front of me to blend together into one big pool of shadow. When I realized the sun was starting to go down, I stopped. I had been so lost in my thoughts, and in finally fulfilling a childhood dream, that I hadn't realized how late it was. I turned around and followed the train tracks, now at a quicker pace, until I reached the area I thought I had started from. I was still following the tracks when a figure emerged from the twilight on the path in front of me. I couldn't make out any details, but it seemed to be entirely gray, like a smudge of ash on the horizon growing steadily larger. Something about it really unsettled me, which I attributed to being a woman walking alone at night and seeing a stranger approach in the twilight. I veered off the tracks and made my way through the woods, emerging one neighborhood over from my own, and followed the streets back to my house, exhausted by the time I finally got there. I guess the stranger I saw on the tracks just left my mind. I didn't think about it at all for the rest of the night, and by the time I woke up the next day, I didn't even remember the vaguely unsettling encounter. It was a few weeks before I was able to make it back into the woods. But once another lazy day off came around, I packed my bag and escaped out the back door again. This time I left a bit earlier and went the other direction, towards what I assumed would be town, or maybe the next town over. I figured if I wandered to the next town by accident, I could always take a taxi home. This was before Uber was very popular. This time, I took a can of spray paint and made a huge blue X on one of the trees that I could see from the tracks, so I would know where to head back into the woods to get home. I can't say for sure, but that decision might have saved my life. Again, time seemed to escape me, and before I knew it, it was late afternoon. I turned myself around, and once again saw a smudge on the distant horizon, slowly approaching me and taking shape. This time there was enough light that I assumed it would be fine, probably just another person wandering the train tracks to fill their empty Sunday afternoon. I kept walking, studying the trees surrounding the tracks on either side, and admiring the giant purple mountains in front of me. I was startled from my reverie to realize that what had been nothing more than a smudge the last time I looked was now a person, just a few hundred yards away at most. I studied him as he approached. He seemed to be wearing a gray three-piece suit and gray shoes. His hair was gray too. He carried some kind of bag. It looked like a white trash bag, like one of the really heavy-duty ones, and it almost looked like it was filled with a liquid. It heaved and sagged. Even though he carried it with such ease, it could have been full of helium. I'll admit, I didn't find him terrifying at first. It was a lovely afternoon. I was enjoying myself, and I've always been a really friendly person. So I was actually kind of excited that I might get to meet one of my neighbors out on my little walk. But when we were close enough for me to greet him, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It was like all my senses shut down, and the only thing I was left with was this awful feeling of complete and total revulsion. Despite my vision going gray around the edges, I forced myself to keep walking, to get past the mystery person and closer to home. When we were right next to each other, all my senses returned to normal, and I noticed with a pang of fear and concern that even the man's skin was an ashy shade of gray. He continued to face forward, but his face seemed to melt and twist in my direction. All the features remained clear, but it was like the skin behind his face was melting, allowing the face itself to slip in my direction. He smiled at me, flashing gray teeth and the corner of a gray tongue peeking out of his mouth. Then he passed me and I took a huge gulp of air, trying to calm my rioting stomach and nerves. Despite how badly I wanted to collapse to the earth and sob from whatever the hell that was, I forced myself to keep walking. Now more than ever, I just wanted to get home. After a few more minutes of walking, I managed to convince myself I had just imagined it, or maybe the man had some kind of medical condition and I was being unfair to judge him so harshly. As I successfully guilt-tripped myself into brushing off the weirdness, I noticed something on the horizon. A gray smudge that seemed to be getting closer to me. I debated it for a moment, then allowed myself to stop and turn around. There was nothing behind me, no traces of the strange gray man. I turned back around, and somehow he had managed to clear almost all the distance between us in the time it took me to turn around and back. I forced myself to keep walking, insisting to my now terrified brain that it was a coincidence, or I had spaced out for longer than I realized. As I got closer to the man, I forced a smile onto my own face, and with every ounce of courage I had asked, "Hey there, didn't we just see each other?" The look on his face didn't alter in the slightest, and neither did his stride as he approached. His mouth opened, and a voice as gray as a tombstone said, "We'll be seeing a lot of each other." The smile on his face stayed in place as mine faltered and crashed, and I picked up my pace to get past him as quickly as possible. As I did, a scent I hadn't noticed before wafted from his trash bag to my nose, and I had to resist the need. It was more than an urge to vomit. What I smelled can only be described as death, plain and simple. It assaulted my nostrils and filled my mind with images of death and destruction, things I never could have pictured on my own. War-torn battlefields scattered with the flesh and blood of innocent people, bodies torn apart by animals, corpses swaying in the breeze, glassy eyes still begging for a savior even though it was far too late. I gasped, pressing my hands to my mouth and nose, and hurried away. After a few minutes, the smell was gone, but the images and nausea remained. I couldn't understand what was wrong with me, and more than anything I just wanted to get home, to safety and my comfiest chair, but I was still at least an hour away from my house. I glanced behind me again, let out a sigh of relief when I saw the gray man still walking away from me, then bit my tongue so hard I drew blood when I turned back and saw another gray smudge on the horizon. I whipped my head around again, and saw he had disappeared. With resignation to my fate, I turned back around already knowing what would be in front of me. Sure enough, the gray man with the gray smile was once again a few hundred yards in front of me. I bit back a little sob and looked around, wondering if I could get away from him somehow. Most of the area between the tracks and the trees was filled with grass and weeds that would go up at least to my waist. I would have been fine with that, except I'm terrified of ticks, and didn't want to risk taking one home with me. As the stranger approached in the distance, I weighed my options. Pass the creepy old guy again, or risk getting a parasite. It was a hard choice, but I finally took a deep breath and plunged into the tall grass. I glanced over at the tracks, almost against my will, and breathed a sigh of relief. He wasn't there. He must have done his little disappearing trick when I stepped off the tracks. I smiled in relief and faced front again, my heart shattering into violent little shards in my chest as I jumped backwards and to the side. He was directly in front of me again, with that same carved from stone, gray-toothed smile. He continued walking forward, eyes on the horizon, fist clenched around the trash bag in his hand. I stopped moving and simply stared at him as he passed, begging my mind to make sense of what was happening. Something in the bag sloshed, and the smell of blood and death overwhelmed me, making me feel sick all over again. I pressed my hands into my eyes, but when I opened them, the gray man was still there, walking away from me, his pace the same as ever. I forced myself to root to the spot and watch him walk away. I waited until the shadows grew longer and he was once again just a gray smudge on the horizon. When I turned back around, I was angry but not surprised to see the gray smear in front of me again. I sighed and continued walking, telling myself it was a coincidence, or I was imagining things. But as he came back into focus, a distant part of my mind screamed that I was in danger. I made the mistake of shoving that voice and its wisdom to the back of my mind. I had to get home. I didn't want to walk in the tall grass and risk getting a tick, and the gray man was going to be there no matter what I did, so I might as well follow the tracks until I made it back home. This time, when the gray man got closer, the smell was the first thing that greeted me. I choked down my vomit and blinked tears from my eyes as I took a deep breath and held it. When the man was about 10 feet from me, something in his smile changed. He didn't move exactly, but his lower jaw seemed to grow, as if the hinges of his jaw were melting and allowing his face to sink lower and lower. For the first time, his eyes met mine, and I knew I had made a horrible mistake. By the time he passed me, his jaw was down to his chest, but his eyes had never left mine. Once he was behind me, I began sprinting, only interested in getting home before it was completely dark. Up ahead, I could just see the bright blue X I had spray painted on the tree, and I veered away from the tracks again, now running through the grass with no other thought in mind than getting back home. But as I ran, my vision began to blur slightly. The shadows of the trees turned gray and seemed to take on more form. Something gray appeared right in front of the tree I had painted on, slowly morphing into a gray man walking towards me, trash bags swinging from his hand. I halted, waited until he was a few feet from me, then bolted to the side, into the tree line. I crashed through the trees wildly, paying attention to nothing except the gray smudges that would appear in front of me, taking shape into the man more rapidly each time. By the time I saw my house in the distance, the gray man was practically running alongside me, smile still carved into his face, bag still swinging in his hand, liquid and whatever else it contained sloshing around inside. I made it inside and locked the doors and windows, but outside I could still see the two pale shadows lurking, taking on the form of a man before disappearing again. I left Pennsylvania not long after that. It lost all its charm for me. But when I lay down in bed at night, all I can see when I close my eyes is the gray man, off in the distance. He gets closer every night, and I know someday he'll catch me. It was the first Saturday of October, and my boyfriend and I found ourselves at the entrance to Twilight Creek Farm's Amazon corn maze. It was around 4 p.m., and the sun had begun to dip towards the horizon. The air had that crisp autumn chill, hinting at a cold night. A cardboard cutout stood at the entrance of a cartoony ear of corn, grinning widely. Yes, it was clear that the intended demographic for this maze was about 2 decades younger than us. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Tyler asked. "Come on, it'll be fun," I replied, grabbing a map from the anthropomorphized corn. Then I linked my arm with his, and the two of us walked into the maze. The corn rose up all around us, about 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Our feet sunk slightly into the muddy ground. In retrospect, it probably wasn't a great idea to go corn mazing after such a heavy rain. But whatever. We were here now. The corn quickly swallowed us up. Within a minute, I could no longer see the entrance. Just corn stretching in every direction. A dense forest, choking out all else. As we rounded the bend, the path ended in a T. There was a metal sign, eroded at the edges, planted firmly in the muddy soil, featuring the cartoon corn again. Remember these tips to ensure a fun time at our A-Maze ing corn maze. First, FSH. Don't tell secrets in the maze. The corn has ears. Winky face. Second, don't stay in the maze after dark. Third, if you're under 13 years old, stay with your parent or caregiver at all times, please. And finally, remember, there are no mirrors in the corn maze. At the bottom of the sign, there were 2 arrows and it read, Easy Kids Maze, EST 20 minutes. Challenging Maze, EST 1 hour. Can we just do the kids' maze? Tyler asked. It's kind of cold. Yeah, but it's so lame, I replied, looking over the map. It's like, literally a straight line. He sighed. Fine. So we turned right, following the path into the corn. Our footsteps squelched softly in the mud. So no mirrors in the corn maze? I asked, trying to start conversation. What do you think that's supposed to mean? He shrugged. Maybe they want to make it clear it's not like one of those haunted funhouse things? Like if you see a path, it's real and not a reflection. I guess. As we walked down the path, an awkward silence fell over us. Okay, I'll admit it. I had an ulterior motive for this trip. Tyler and I had been fighting on and off all week. Just little things here and there sniping at each other. It was like something in the air had changed between us. Little things were annoying him and me constantly. Maybe it was the shorter days, the lack of sunlight getting to us. Maybe, at almost a year of dating, we were finally coming out of the honeymoon phase. Whatever it was, I felt like a change of scenery would do us some good. Of course, I was starting to regret that now, with the chill creeping into the air and the mud sticking to my sneakers. We probably should have just postponed to next weekend, when it wasn't after a heavy rain. But I felt like I couldn't take one more minute in that apartment. Which way now? Tyler's voice jerked me out of my thoughts. I looked up. Ahead of us, the path split into 3, each path considerably narrower than the one we were on. I looked down at the map, but I didn't see any places where the path split in 3. I don't know. He raised an eyebrow at me. We're lost already? I looked down at the map again, scanning the schematic. The cartoony ear of corn smiled up at me from the paper, and I wanted to punch it in the face. I don't see any places where it splits in 3, I said, handing him the map. He said, looking over it. Maybe that's part of the challenge. The map is wrong. That'd be kind of interesting. Don't they say if you want to get out of a maze, stick to one side? Like keep your hand touching one wall? He stretched his arm out and touched the corn on the right. Yeah, I followed him down the rightmost path. It suddenly seemed darker, probably because the path was only about half the width of the previous one, and we were deep in the shadows of the corn. Dry leaves brushed against my arms, feeling more like rough claws, raking against my skin. I felt the cold of the mud permeating through my shoes with each step. We passed an intersection, and for a split second, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw someone walking in the other direction. But when I turned my head, nothing was there. I thought I started to Tyler. Then I shook my head. Never mind, probably just my hair, falling into my line of vision. Still, I was starting to really not like this. We made another right and another following the wall. But we didn't find an exit. More layers of mud caked onto my shoes. I was so tired. Maybe we should just turn around and go home, I called out behind him. He turned around, his eyes lighting up. Really? Yeah. Should be easy enough to backtrack. We can follow our footprints. Sounds good to me, he replied. We turned around and began to follow our footprints back. But 15 or 20 minutes later, we still hadn't found the entrance. We haven't been here that long. We should be out by now. Are you sure we came this way? I called out as I followed Tyler down a sharp right turn I didn't remember taking. Has to be, he replied, gesturing to our footprints. But when we turned the corner, we found not one set of our prints, but 2. We were going in circles. This is ridiculous, Tyler huffed. Maybe we should call someone. I pulled out my phone, and my heart dropped. It was 5:23 p.m. Over an hour since we'd entered the maze. What? Tyler asked, seeing my face drop. I held up my phone. We haven't been here this long. Have we? He paused for a second, then shook his head. We have to follow our footprints out. We'll get out eventually. And if we're really lost, we can call 911 or something. Okay. So which way? I asked. One set of footprints went down each path. Left. We were making all rights before, so it should be lefts to get out. We veered left. The corn seemed to squeeze in on us, the path growing narrower with each step. Like the field of corn was some kind of monster, ready to engulf us at any second. I shook my head and continued forward. There's nothing wrong here. We're just lost in a challenging maze, that's all. But when the path widened, I realized how wrong I was. We were standing in a clearing about the size of my kitchen. There was a sign, the same battered thin metal as before, in the middle. I froze as I began to read. There are two ways out of this maze. You can either find the way out on your own, or you can choose to leave behind one person in your party, and the exit will make itself known to you. Either way, make sure you're out of the maze by nightfall, because then nobody makes it out. Smiley face. The cartoon corn man was painted on the bottom of the sign, grinning up at us. This time there was a bit of rust or red paint around his mouth. I couldn't tell if it was intentional or not. My heart began to pound. I felt like I couldn't get enough air in my lungs, like a panic attack was about to start. Tyler burst into laughter behind me. What? They're trying so hard to make this like a scary ARG or something, he said, laughing. So lame. I whipped around, arms crossed. You don't actually believe it, do you? All I know is we've been walking around this maze for an hour, but it's only felt like 20 minutes, and the map doesn't match the maze, and I don't remember parts of the maze that we've clearly been to because our footprints are there. I said all in one breath. I stared at him, panting, my heart pounding in my chest. Kate, I'm sorry. You're really scared, huh? And so are you. I saw how scared you looked when you realized we were going in circles. But now you're just going to pass it off and pretend it's all a game. Kate, I want to get out of here, I shouted. Whatever this is, game or not. I hate it and I want to go home. Tyler put up his hands defensively. Whoa, okay. I'm sorry. Let's just keep going left. We'll get out. Promise. Huffing. I cut in front of him and veered down the left path, leading the way. My shoes squelched loudly. The path narrowed again, corn clawing at my shoulders and hips. We curved left and right, and then, to my relief, the path opened up wider in front of us. We're out. The hope leaked out of me like a deflating balloon. The path did open up into a much larger area, clearing like the last one, but I hadn't remembered seeing the clearing, despite footprints trailing all over it. Our footprints, crisscrossing, frantic, some clearly made by us running. The depressions in the mud deep and smudged. I turned around. No, Tyler wasn't behind me. My legs went weak underneath me. Tyler, I shouted. The path curved behind me, disappearing into the darkness. No sign of Tyler. I scanned the corn surrounding the clearing, but it was dark and shadowy and infinite, stretching in every direction. Tyler! The corn rustled, somewhere to my left. I glanced over, but I couldn't see anything. The corn was too dense, the shadows too dark. The sky was darkening now, threatening dusk. It was nearly pitch black in the shadows of the cornfield. I stared at the mess of footprints on the ground. What the hell is going on? I pulled out my phone and called Tyler. It rang several times, then voicemail picked up. Fuck. I called him a second time and a third. He didn't pick up. For a while I just stood there, calling his name. The sky deepened to dark blue above me. The corn rustled in the breeze, stretching in every direction. Birds soared to their nests, chirping. Then the chittering of bats overhead filled the silence. There were two paths at either end of the clearing, one curving left, one curving right. Now they were pitch black, like looking into the deepest of forests, choking out every last bit of light. I turned on my phone's flashlight and swept it down the entrance of each, but nothing appeared to be there. Just stalks and stalks of corn, all lines and shadows overlapping each other. And then, finally, I heard something. Somewhere, down the left path, from just out of my view, I heard a soft whimpering sound. Tyler, a rough whisper. Kate? I approached the path, my heart pounding in my ears. I held the phone out in front of me, lighting up the path. Tyler? I whispered, and then I saw the blood, the patch of wet and dark, mingling with the mud. I swept my flashlight over the corn. The beam of light fell on a bloody hand, lying in the mud, just a few feet within the corn. I jerked the flashlight back, revealing an arm, and then Tyler's face. He was so pale. His eyes were wide. His cheeks were smeared with blood. Kate, he groaned, a horrible gurgling sound mingling with his voice. I'm coming. I'm going to get you out of there. I tried to force my way through the corn, but it was impossible. They were planted only 6 inches, maybe a foot apart. I didn't have the strength to bend or snap them. Tyler, what happened? He didn't get the chance to tell me. I watched in horror as his body began to slide backwards through the corn, as if something was dragging him. Tyler! I screamed. The sound of cornstalks snapping filled the air. I frantically shone my flashlight into the corn, sweeping it in every direction. But all I saw was more and more corn, everywhere, filling up every square inch of space. I ran back through the clearing, back down one of the paths, pulled out my phone and dialed 911. My boyfriend and I are in a corn maze, and he's hurt. I think there might be someone out there, and... Slow down, please, the woman said. You said you're at a corn maze? Her tone sounded skeptical. Yeah. Where? Twilight Creek Farms. A beat of silence. Do you know what the punishment is for calling emergency services? When there is no emergency? She asked, her voice sharp. What? Prank calls can put you in jail for a year. Did you know that? I stared at the corn, my throat closing. What? This isn't a prank call. My boyfriend is really hurt. I think someone... Ma'am, she cut off. Twilight Creek Farms has been closed for 3 months now. Ever since the bodies were found, all the air sucked out of my lungs. Bodies? I croaked. We've gotten over 24 calls since then, claiming that someone's in trouble, she replied, condescendingly. But the entire farm was razed, since they lost all their money in the wrongful death suit. So what kind of game are you trying to play? I trailed off. 3 months. What month is it? A scoff. January. The phone fell from my hands. This can't be real. I must be dreaming. I wheeled around, the white of my phone's flashlight sweeping over the corn. The path curved away into darkness, deeper into the corn. I snatched my phone off the ground and walked back towards the clearing. But it wasn't there. Like the corn had swallowed it up, grown in its place in the span of minutes. What the fuck is going on here? The sound of footsteps jerked me out of my daze. Squelch. Getting louder. Coming closer. Squelch. I turned the flashlight off and began running in a random direction. I took every left turn, keeping against the left wall of corn, praying I would find an exit. I tried calling 911 again and again, but no one ever picked up. They must have flagged my number as some sort of prank call. The farm has to have some safety system in place. They let kids come here. They have to search the maze before they close up for the night. They wouldn't just let people die here. I stopped to catch my breath. My lungs burned. I couldn't run anymore. I just couldn't. I stood halfway bent over in the middle of a narrow path, the corn impossibly close, sucking in lungful after lungful of icy air. Kate, Tyler's voice, incredibly quiet, barely a whisper, from somewhere in front of me. I began running blindly towards him. The path zigzagged left, then right, and then I saw him. Tyler was standing at the end of the path, facing away from me. His form illuminated in silver moonlight, the shadows of the corn crisscrossing over his back. Tyler, I whispered. I ran towards him, but halfway there I stopped. Something is wrong. He wasn't turning around to look at me, wasn't moving at all. Tyler? Nothing. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Hands shaking, I lifted it up. No. It was wearing his clothes. But it wasn't him. It was a scarecrow. Hay poked out of the neckline of his shirt, out of the cuffs of his jeans. His hands were just bunches of hay, girdled with twine. Stray pieces of hay scattered the ground, falling out of his hiking boots. But wait, that didn't quite make sense. Because he had hair. Undeniably his hair wavy and black. The gears in my brain spun, trying to figure out what exactly was going on. Trying to interpret this thing standing in front of me. Stuffed with hay, with his clothes, his hair. And then I realized it. The body was a scarecrow, but the head was not. I could see Tyler's pale ears. The blood dripping onto the hay of his neck. I opened my mouth to scream. The corn stalks rustled and snapped, shaking violently as something moved within them. And then it emerged. A scarecrow, moving in jerky, stilted movements, towards me. Holding a long silver blade dripping with blood. Missing a head. I took off down the path. My feet pounded underneath me. My lungs burned. I tried to keep right because I'd been going left the other way. Did that even make sense? But everything blurred and smeared in my mind. All I saw was corn, endless rows of it, lit by the moonlight. Pitch black shadows underneath it. A silver moon hanging overhead. Bats twirling and tilting through the air. After what felt like hours of running, I finally accepted my fate. I'm never getting out of here, and neither is Tyler. Somehow I evaded the scarecrow all night. Before I knew it, the sun was rising. I thought I'd finally found salvation when I heard voices on the other side of the corn. But then I realized what they were saying. Are you sure you want to do this? Come on, it'll be fun. It was our voices. I screamed until I was hoarse, telling them, asterisk us? Asterisk to stay away. I screamed for help. I tried everything. I clawed my way through the corn, towards where I'd heard them, because clearly they were at the entrance. But all I found was more and more corn. It was futile. At one point I think I broke through for just an instant. But then I watched her shake her head and say, never mind. Time passes strangely here, with all our days in the cornfield overlapping each other. Rows upon rows of our footprints cross the dirt, from an eternity of running from the scarecrow. Every time I try to stop Tyler from getting taken, and every time I fail. And then there's always the night. I spend every night evading the headless scarecrow. I know my own fate. I know it was bodies, not a body that was found at the cornfield. I know I don't make it out alive. But I evade her anyway, hiding in the corn, deluding myself that if I stay alive long enough, maybe I will get out. I'm sure it's been more than 3 months now, but the moon rises all the same, hanging silver over the corn. The stalks rustle and snap. I hide in the corn, my breathing fast and heavy, praying that one day I will find a way out. I know that day will never come,